Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're very excited to make today's presentation available to you. These faculty-led workshops are sponsored by the Provost's Office, the Teaching Academy, and Academic Outreach and Innovation, which is the parent organization for the Global Campus, of which I belong to. I'm Susan Fine, and I'm one of the e-learning consultants at the Global Campus. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Sheila Converse speaking to us on the topic that's obviously of interest to everybody, how to motivate your students to come to class prepared. And I had one little tidbit about Dr. Converse, that she's won lots of awards, but the one that was noted most recently is the 2014-2015 Samuel H. Smith Leadership Award. So we're very proud to have her presenting this important information to you today. So I will turn it over to Dr. Converse.
So when Rebecca asked me, I don't really feel like I need a microphone, as you can tell, but since we have to do this, would I do a presentation on motivating students to come to class prepared? I thought, well, I don't know that this is really something I know a lot about. I don't pretend in any way to be an expert, but I've done a lot of exploring about this idea because obviously it's a huge problem. So I've talked to a lot of colleagues, I've read some things, I've thought about it, I've experimented. So what I'm hoping is we'll just share some ideas today with you and just see if some of these things are helpful to you. I teach 4 very different kinds of classes, and in those 4 classes, they have a lot of different permutations about why students are there. I teach a 25-person honors class. Honors students tend to be very motivated. They usually tend to come to class. They're kind of intrinsically motivated. Well, they're also a little bit extrinsically motivated. And for years, they just came to class. And since the class is primarily discussion-based, I didn't worry about it. Then all of a sudden, I had students who weren't showing up and then came at the end and said, well, how come I didn't get an A? And I said, well, it's a discussion-based class. You were missing a third of the time. So the last year, I just started taking attendance, which was odd. I teach a 50-person UCOR class. It fulfills the diversity requirement. It's a women in music class where I want them to listen to songs and think about the texts. I teach a 10 to 20-person class for majors. It's a course they have to take and they have to pass to get their degree, so they are motivated to come. And then I taught a 25-person Intro to Music survey class. And it was the first time I'd taught freshmen in a long time, and that was very eye-opening and very frustrating at the same time. And one of the things I figured out in that class was I really had to teach them how to be college students. And that was more important than the content that I was trying to teach them. So,
what do you mean by 25%, 10%? Are you co-teaching or what does
25-person.
Oh,
Student, not percent. Okay?
Sheila,
so take a second.
Can I briefly interrupt? And I apologize. I should have said this earlier. If you have questions, you need to let me come over and give you the microphone because we have people attending via the live stream and they can't hear you unless you use the microphone. So I apologize for that interruption.
Okay.
Thank you.
So jot down your classes. What do you teach? First question on your quiz. What kinds of classes do you teach? How many people?
Sheila, those aren't really WSU students, are they? I never looked at them.
Of course they are. That's my class. Oh, yeah, shh. Don't point things out. So we're looking at ideals. That's the ideal. So we're going to look at thinking about this in kind of 3 parts. So part of it is the overall concepts of teaching and designing class, and then class design, and then some extrinsic motivators. Idealistic as I am, I still know that sometimes you do need to make it worth their while to come besides what's happening in the class. So one of the first things is that there are these overall concepts, or maybe a philosophy of teaching or a philosophy of how to design a class. And one of those is to offer value beyond the book. So would you take a second and just make a note? How do you give value beyond the book? In your class, can they get all the material if they stay home? Or is there something happening in the classroom that gives them some value beyond the book? Then would you take a second and just share those ideas with the people near you? So what are some of the things you do, and go ahead and have a short conversation.
Not like now, after they're done with this, should I make a microphone at front of at one end or the other, or will you?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. I'll just stand up and be ready to go.
Okay.
Wait for the mic, and then we'll get two going, and then I can grab the one that's done being used.
Want me to go to that end with one?
No, I was going to say,
Okay.
I mean, you know,
Okay.
like if
Oh, I see what you
somebody
mean.
at this end,
Gotcha.
I'll get-
Maybe not. I think this is fine as is. I'll just walk. Okay. Okay, so the next topic is basically this problem of the fact that we now have cell phones and computers in class. The music building for the longest time didn't have internet in the classrooms, which was kind of a blessing. And so we just didn't deal with it. But now we do. So now students have their computers and they have their cell phones in the classroom. And the problem for the teacher is, how can you be more interesting than social media? So again, take a minute and think about your own class. Are you more interesting than social media? And if so, how? You can't say I'm not. Let's do this one. So I'd like you to share some of these ideas, and can we have a microphone at each end? Does somebody have one idea to share about the whole social media issue? There's a lot of talk at both ends.
Here.
You got it. Go for it.
So at our table, we talked about how you sort of want to keep them off kilter a little bit, that they don't know what you're going to do next. So they're not 100% sure what to expect, and they really would hate to miss what you just said or just did because they were paying attention to their social media.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I can't compete with it. I can't be more engaging than social media, so I've given up asking the question.
Okay.
And I'm incorporating social media into the class
Aha.
so that they actually get permission to use something that they're already motivated to look at.
Okay.
I also, at times, take it off the table completely, and unfortunately, that piece is not working as well because I feel like I then have to police. But there are times when, like, having something open on their cell phones or their laptops is distracting. And so by creating times that we can use it and it's acceptable, and then times when it's not allowed at all, kind of gives them more flexibility.
Okay.
And makes me feel like less of a social media Nazi.
Anybody else have a thought? Yeah.
Personally, I don't think I'm more engaging, but I think I provide a respite from it, at least for a little while, so that
Okay.
they don't have to be a slave to it
Okay.
for an hour or so, and they can actually think about a topic or a couple of topics, and they're not bombarded by what their friend's friend is eating for lunch. And some of them, it takes a little while for them to acclimate to that,
Yeah.
but by the end, I don't have any problems with it because they come to appreciate it more than they did in the beginning.
Great. Okay. Yeah.
I am a cell phone Nazi. I don't allow it in the classroom. And if a phone goes off, that person has to buy cookies for the rest of for the next time.
Oh,
And
excellent.
one cell phone has gone off this semester. And they were lousy cookies.
Okay, so this summer I read a book called What the Best College Teachers Do. It was a very interesting book. And this was a question that was raised in this book. We talk about what classes we teach. In fact, I asked you that. We talk about teaching a class. We talk about the contents of our class. What happens instead if you reframe that and say you teach a student or 250 students, but you make it about the student instead of about the class? Take a second and just reflect on that idea. And again, if you'd like to share that with the people near you, that would be good, since some of you already are. So go ahead and have just a little conversation with people about what you thought about that idea. So would anybody be willing to share what your conversations have entailed? Volunteers?
So we just talked about if you are just working with a student, then you can reflect the discussion to basically the needs of that particular student. So you can basically find their strengths, their weaknesses, and tailor the way you are teaching the material to their needs. If you are teaching a bigger class, you can't just do that. You have to go with the generalities of what you need to cover. So you have to finish a certain set of material, you need to finish it, and so that's different.
Okay. Anybody else?
I work with a team that's teaching the Human Development 101 class, so we have 100 plus students in each section, and we are building that class around some of the learning strategies from the A game. And so it's been nice for the students to connect with activities in class that they're familiar with if they've read the book, or that we can refer them to that. So that's been one piece. And then in my senior level class, I'm doing a lot more assessment. I was just saying small assessments, participation points mostly, but enough to give me an understanding of what my students understand and what they don't, and how I can change up education on a day-to-day basis to reach what they need.
Okay. And I've taught a vocal pedagogy class for years. It was always very successful until recently, and then it wasn't successful. I've had 4 students out of 18 who had the opportunity to take it again. And I thought that was somehow we wasn't working. So this idea for me was really important, because when I thought about teaching the class, I thought about the body of information I wanted them to learn. And when I started instead thinking about the students, I really changed how I've been presenting that class. It's a work in progress. So let's talk a little bit about course design, and this relates to all of this as well. So one of the things I learned from my friend Sam Swindell was, you want to think about a class, what do you want them to know at the end? But not just what information. You also want to think about what skills they need, what reasoning abilities, what do they need to be able to do at the end of the class? Not just the content, not just the facts, but what are all the things that are in there that you want them to begin to be able to do at the end of a class? So reasoning abilities, kinds of skills, ways to think about your subject matter, and developing those as well as content information as you go along. And then thinking about building assignments and readings, etc., based on where you want them to be at the end of the class, what they're able to do or what they're able to understand. And in that process, you want to have a lot of opportunities for them to practice that material in class. So you review it, get them to answer questions. Think about how, if this is where you want to end up, how are you going to help them practice each step along the way in order to get there? So that's one of the things to think about. And think about, just go ahead and take a second and jot down how your class is designed, and whether or not you could change it in a way that has to do with what reasoning abilities, skills, etc. they need at the end, which is a different way of thinking what content do they need to have and how those interact or are related. Now think about your class or classes. Okay? I'd like you to all stand up. Go make a friend, somebody else that you haven't talked to, and share your ideas with somebody you don't know. You can introduce yourselves as well. That would be good. No, I think it's better. It's more chaotic if everybody moves. Good for you. Crossing the center. I don't think we're good. I think I'll just let them.
Later at the very end when I have to thank everybody for being here.
Well, I may ask them more, but at least for this question. Yeah. So maybe. So let's bring this conversation to an end-ish. Exchange phone numbers. Email addresses. So in my vocal pedagogy class that I have redesigned, I always had them learn a whole lot of information, the parts of the larynx, where the cricoid cartilage was, what muscles close the vocal folds, a whole lot of information, and then I tested them on it. This year, instead of doing that, I'm having them learn that information, but they're learning why it's important. So it's important to know where the larynx is. You have to know that there are muscles there. It's important that remembering that so you know why it's important to stand up straight and not do weird things with your head. And so we're spending a lot more time learning the why of and the relationship between, figuring that in a lot of ways they could go look up the facts if need be. They need to know the names, they need to know what they should look up, but at least spending a lot more time on the relationships between. So I ask a lot of questions, and I'm really trying to ask more questions and tell fewer answers. So if a student comes in with a question, instead of my telling them the answer, I will either ask them another question, oh, so if this is true, would this be true, and help them work their way through, or I ask other students in the class if they have ideas about how to answer the question, so that I climb off Mount Olympus and tell them that they actually have a lot of control over their own learning. I often will say, that's a really great question. Get out your cell phone, get out your computer, let's look it up and see what you can find. So instead of my being the source of information, even though I have so many things to tell them, I want them to go and begin to seek out the information for themselves. So asking lots and lots of questions. We are all trained in our fields. Most of us are quite good at the thing that we teach. What we're not trained in, most of us, is how to teach. And so that's one of the problems that a lot of people face as a college teacher. I remember taking a ride with my friend who's in music ed, where he's had a lot of education classes. And he said, you know, there's a really simple thing you can do. Tell them the topics at the beginning, teach the tough stuff in the middle, review it at the end. I was like, duh, well, that's a good idea. So I started doing it. And the most amazing thing about it was it forced me to focus. What are the 3 things I'm going to cover in this class that will fit on a PowerPoint slide? How can I illustrate them? And then at the end, review them. Ideas like that that are so simple, once somebody tells you about them, you're kind of like, geez, why didn't I think of that? So I think one of the things that helps a great deal is to talk to other faculty. What do you do in your class? I'm having this problem. How do you solve it? So the more you talk to people, I think the more you learn about education. In this book, which was given to me by a dear friend, it's written by John Medina, and he actually graduated from WSU and works at that other school. But he talks about the fact that we're only good for about 10 minutes. In any class, you have 10 minutes. And if you go beyond that, you've lost your group. So thinking about dividing your 50 minutes into 5 segments, and at the end of that 10 minutes, tell a story, tell a joke, have them all stand up and talk to each other, get them moving around the room, change the topic. But thinking in 10-minute segments. And even though in my head I know that, a lot of times I'll have something that just, I have to tell them all about it, and we go past the 10 minutes and you can just see them. And even though I know, I'm thinking, uh-oh, I went too long, back up, stop, say something else, change the topic. Keep thinking in that 10-minute loop. So another thing that helps a great deal is any kind of active learning activities. So you've all heard this term. Again, take a minute, talk to each other. What are some of the active learning things that you do in your classrooms? So go ahead and have a bit of a conversation. Oops, you can write it down first. Think, then pair, then share. the activities you may do in your classroom that helps keep it a little more active?
Drawing while you're learning, or doing mapping of what you're learning by yourself or groups on the board, mapping, doing
Okay.
concept mapping.
Concept maps, okay. Anything else? Other thoughts? You were all talking.
In my class, we usually do group activities, and also like for each chapter. Since I teach Spanish, I make them be in groups of 3, and then for each chapter, we always like come up with new groups so they meet the whole class.
Oh, good. Okay.
So for each period, I make them get up and then meet other classmates and different topics, so they keep them engaged in class.
Great. Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we do think pair share
Sure.
in the class too, and we pose a problem and then they think about it and share with the class.
Sure.
We also do handouts, sheets, like distribute to them, and then they also think about the problem, solve it, think to their partner, and then we solve it together.
Okay.
So.
Great. Anything else? Anybody do
Just
games? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to mention.
Sorry.
Teach 100 students and do a few games. One of them works well because they get in groups of 5, discuss for 5 minutes, turn in a sheet, and a Excel simulation. I can put in real quick what everybody did, and they can see the winner, and they get prizes and things. So at least on that one day, everybody in class participated. And then next week, doesn't involve everybody, but I bring up 8 people and they make paper airplanes.
Oh.
But to keep everybody else interested, they have to sing a song as part of their production process. So they stand up and clap and dance, turn around. It's a Wiggles song. And that keeps it kind of light, and the others are interested. And hopefully at the end, one assembly line has a ton of inventory and the other one doesn't, and I can then hopefully make my point educationally.
So I do flashcards. Sometimes I'm teaching in this. Sometimes I have to teach the vowels for the International Phonetic Alphabet. So we do flashcards, and they have to stand up and sit down, depending on who got it right. You know, I make little things, cutouts that they all go around and quiz each other. We'll do contests where we have terms, and they make teams, and they get to candy. I'm into all of it. So you can do interviews. So a lot of times, like when I was teaching the women in music, I would give them a sheet of paper and I'd say, okay, everybody up, go talk to 2 people and find out what they know about jazz. And so while they're doing that, we eventually get everybody's up, everybody's talking. We eventually put them all up on the board. But that idea of up and out of their seats and not just sitting there quietly can be helpful. This was another of these interesting things from what the best college teachers teach. And he talked about the banking model of teaching, where the teacher comes in with all of the information and they deposit it into the students' heads. And then the student comes back on the exams and regurgitates all of the information, which he referred to as a bulimic performance. And a lot of times that information doesn't stick very long. It's kind of in and out again. And that's a really interesting concept, the banking model versus the bulimic way of performing, which if you start to do some of the other ways of teaching a class, you get away from. I think in some classes you have to do it. You have to have them learn certain information. So it's not always possible to change it, but in a lot of cases, I think it is. I use a lot of personal stories in my classes. I feel like it makes the students feel a little bit more connected to me. So I tell funny stories on myself. My poor children, if they knew all the stories I tell about them, they would be most unhappy. And I think a lot about mastery of certain skills, and know that not all students will do equally well. Right now I have a student who really, he knows the information, but he has a terrible time getting it out. I think that's a Winnie the Pooh problem. It's perfectly clear inside, but it gets mixed up on the way out. So I try to call on him a lot so he has to verbalize the things. Other people are really great at verbalization, so it's just thinking, it's a small class, I can do stuff you can't do in a big class. So one of the things we talk a lot about is this whole idea of critical thinking and what reasoning skills, what evaluating skills, problem solving, decision making. And I feel like that's something that's really important for us to incorporate into our classes. And we use the term a lot, but we don't always think about how it is and what you have to do to get them there. And I think if you go back to some of the thoughts about asking a lot of questions and questioning their assumptions. So in this class, the students do some reading, and they say, well, when you sing, the ideal alignment is to stand with one foot in front of the other, and then you sing. And so I said, well, why? Why is that a good idea? Well, it's in the book, or I've read it on the web. And I said, what does it do to your pelvis? Well, it twists it. So is it a good idea? Oh, maybe not. Okay, so just because it's written doesn't mean it's right. And seeing if you can incorporate that more and more into the classroom, examining the material and asking them questions. So we've done all these cool things, but ultimately you also may need some extrinsic motivators. Candy, did you say, was one? Which is why I did the M&Ms. And some of those are just things like in the honors class, when I was giving them points for coming to class, I had to know if they were there. So I simply handed around a sign-in sheet. They knew that I knew that they were there every time. And then when there were 3 that missed about a third of the classes, when I took that many points off their final grade, they didn't question it, because there it was, I had taken attendance. Now, to me, I hated the idea of going to that, but if I was going to give them credit for being there and being part of the discussion, they had to know I knew. Another thing I've done is to take a picture of them, and we have the pictures on the roster, but they always sit in the same seats. So I would have them hold a piece of paper with their name, and I would just go with my camera and take a picture of 3 at a time. And I put them up on my computer, and so whenever I did any grading, oh, there's Susie, okay. And then I would learn a lot of their names. Not all of them, but a lot of them. One time in my class, it was an 11 o'clock class, and there was a young woman who fell asleep in every class. It was her nap time. And one day, she didn't. And as she was leaving the class, I said, Sue, you didn't go to sleep today. Congratulations. She was like, you know who I am. And that, she never fell asleep again. It made all the difference that I knew who she was. So anyway, I mean, in many classes, it's simply not possible if you're teaching 150 or 200 kids. But if you can learn any of them or more of them, that really helps enormously. Another thing that you can do is to do a question. So they walk in the door, and the first thing you do is hand them a piece of paper and ask them to answer that question. Now, they could then hand that into you, and you can make it worth 5 points or whatever. You also have a way of taking attendance if you do that. The other thing you can do is to immediately share that information with somebody else so you can have them discuss it. So it could be the first question you're going to talk about for the day. They could talk to each other about it. You get the conversation going. Students tend to be more accountable to their peers. So if they know that they're going to come in, you're going to ask a question, and then they're going to have to turn to the person next to them. It's pretty embarrassing to say, well, I didn't do the homework. Whereas if they did do it, begins to engage. That's a simple thing you can do. You can obviously do quizzes, a short 2-question quiz right at the beginning. Let's see, I think that was everything I had. So what are some of the things you do that are extrinsic motivators that get them to come to class? What are some of the things people can share?
So we have a weekly homework and a weekly quiz.
Okay.
And the weekly homework is on a day, and the weekly quiz on another day.
Ah,
And
very good.
They have to submit the homework at the beginning of a class to get a grade.
Uh-huh.
If they submit it by the end of the class, it's a 0. And if they don't submit it, it's negative the grade. that brings everybody to class every basically period. And in that period in the middle, they get to know what the quiz is on next time. So also they need to come. So I have 105, and most of the times I have 105 in a class.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay. Others? Things you do?
You'd mentioned taking attendance, and I've got small enough classes, about 25 students per class, but one of the things that I try to do is if I see a student that is at risk, I try to email them at some point. Maybe it's a third of the way through, maybe it's halfway through, and then I try to follow up. A lot of them don't realize they've missed so many classes.
Right.
And also in line with that, when I do email students for whatever reasons, I try to use their first name. So
Okay.
just identifying that even if I have to look it up in the spreadsheet, I'm using their first name, which suggests I know who they are.
Sure. Yeah, in the women in music class, I used to take attendance sort of sporadically. I didn't remember to do it every time. And I told them that what I would use it for was if they came to me with a problem. Can I turn my paper in late? Gee, can I take this early or whatever? I would look at their attendance. And if they had been there every time, I'd say yes. But if they'd missed a lot of classes, I figure, So I had a young woman email me, and she was 2 weeks late on the paper. She said, I just realized that the paper was due. Can I turn it in late? So I looked at her attendance. She had missed over a third of the classes, and this is halfway through the semester. So I emailed her back and I said, well, you've missed this many classes out of this many so far this semester. And I said, if you were me, would you let you turn the paper in late? And much to her credit, she said no, and we agreed. So it's sort of, a variable. A lot of students came to that class just because it was interesting. It was fun to talk about the songs, and it was a different thing than a lot of their other classes. But, so it really varies. Any other extrinsic ways you get them in the door? Anybody? All right. Well, I guess we are, any other questions? Are there questions? We have 5 minutes, yeah.
I was drawn to this workshop because the title was how do you motivate students to come prepared? So I'm able to get students to class and active in class, but a lot of times they haven't done the online readings or assignments.
Okay.
And so that's another piece of the formula that I'm interested in hearing other people's ideas. Like, how do you motivate preparation prior to class?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add on that, a common problem that I have is when you ask them to do like a question at the beginning or discuss with other students, if they all haven't done the reading, then they sort of feel almost like they are meeting the norm rather than making them feel bad. They feel like, oh good, no one else did it either. And so I found that sometimes that can backfire, and I don't know how to use that as a better motivator rather than just having them all feel like, oh, no one did it, so it's not a big deal.
So it doesn't matter. Thoughts? Do I have thoughts? Yeah. Back.
Hi. So going back onto that comment, for as far as the Spanish classes, we give them attendance and participation points. So we base it off of 5 points a day. So if they didn't do the reading and they're just pretty much dinking around the whole class time, I kindly remind them sometimes, or we make jokes about it, that you didn't do the reading, so that's going to hurt your participation for today. And in some cases, it does motivate them to actually do the readings or actually do something to prepare for the next class. Although you do have the students that just kind of continuously fall back and never do any of the assignments. But for the most part, I feel like that works, that we include in their attendance a participation aspect to it, because then it gives it value to those who did do the work versus the ones that continuously stopped doing it. So.
I tried unscheduled quizzes because I thought that might help. And one of the really good students came to me and said, they're really unfair to really good students. He says, I have to choose what homework I'm going to do. I can't do everything. So if I know there's a quiz, I'll study for it. But when it's random, I don't know how to prioritize. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I don't have a solution, but it was an interesting comment from a very good student who always came and was always prepared. So sometimes unscheduled quizzes are motivating, sometimes they're not. Other thoughts about how to get them?
We're using the Common Reading Book, and as we go through chapters, anytime that we're going to seminar the book, then we ask students to bring 3 questions that they have and a paragraph reflection. And of course, there are still students who come without that, but they get points for that at the end of the semester. But it helps them prepare for seminaring also with their peers.
Sure.
And that hopefully is helping them be motivated to do that.
Yeah. In the 100 level class, I had them write a brief summary of the chapter, which they handed in at the beginning of each class. And that was, again, attendance, but it helped get them to do that. But if it's a big class, it's very hard. That's a lot of looking, unless it's pretty short. So maybe, maybe not. Other thoughts? Yeah.
In a blended or flip format, getting them to prepare and read the book, listen to the lectures is by far the most difficult part of doing this. I found that giving a quiz online, directed very closely to the online lecture, helps. It doesn't solve everything, but it does help, because at least they had to go look it up or find that part of the lecture to answer the question. So I think that is one thing. I give a lot of quizzes in class in the face-to-face part. And one thing I've learned, does everybody know what a sliding average is? If you have some data, you can average, and it smooths it out. I give a sliding quiz. And what that means is the topics overlap. And so they have to revisit the older material. And I think that's very effective.
Okay.
The quiz part does motivate.
I know.
So that's part of what I was trying to say.
Hence the M&Ms.
Yeah, right.
Anybody have anything else to add? I think one of the things is no one thing works in every class. Something that worked in one class, you can teach the same class and it doesn't work the next time because the personalities change. Some of it is your personality and whether you're comfortable doing some of these things. So I don't think they're good answers. I think there are a lot of different answers, and it's worth experimenting with all different kinds of things and see what works for you and your class or classes. Thank you very much. Have the good rest of your day. To you. I teach 4 very different kinds of classes, and in those 4 classes, they have a lot of different permutations about why students are there. I teach a 25-person honors class. Honors students tend to be very motivated. They usually tend to come to class. They're kind of intrinsically motivated. Well, they're also a little bit extrinsically motivated. And for years, they just came to class. And since the class is primarily discussion-based, I didn't worry about it. Then all of a sudden, I had students who weren't showing up and then came at the end and said, well, how come I didn't get an A? And I said, well, it's a discussion-based class. You were missing a third of the time. So the last year, I just started taking attendance, which was odd. I teach a 50-person UCOR class. It fulfills the diversity requirement. It's a women in music class where I want them to listen to songs and think about the texts. I teach a 10 to 20-person class for majors. It's a course they have to take and they have to pass to get their degree, so they are motivated to come. And then I taught a 25-person Intro to Music survey class. And it was the first time I'd taught freshmen in a long time, and that was very eye-opening and very frustrating at the same time. And one of the things I figured out in that class was I really had to teach them how to be college students. And that was more important than the content that I was trying to teach them. So,
What do you mean by 25%, 10%? Are you co-teaching or what does
25-person.
Oh,
Student, not percent. Okay?
Sheila,
so take a second.
Can I briefly interrupt? And I apologize. I should have said this earlier. If you have questions, you need to let me come over and give you the microphone because we have people attending via the live stream and they can't hear you unless you use the microphone. So I apologize for that interruption.
Okay.
Thank you.
So jot down your classes. What do you teach? First question on your quiz. What kinds of classes do you teach? How many people?
Sheila, those aren't really WSU students, are they?
Of,
I never looked at them.
of course they are. That's my class. Oh, yeah, shh. Don't point things out. So we're looking at ideals. That's the ideal. So we're going to look at thinking about this in kind of three parts. So part of it is the overall concepts of teaching and designing class, and then class design, and then some extrinsic motivators. Idealistic as I am, I still know that sometimes you do need to make it worth their while to come besides what's happening in the class. So one of the first things is that there are these overall concepts, or maybe a philosophy of teaching or a philosophy of how to.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're very excited to make today's presentation available to you. These faculty-led workshops are sponsored by the Provost's Office, the Teaching Academy, and Academic Outreach and Innovation, which is the parent organization for the Global Campus, of which I belong to. I'm Susan Fine, and I'm one of the e-learning consultants at the Global Campus. Today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Sheila Converse speaking to us on the topic that's obviously of interest to everybody, how to motivate your students to come to class prepared. And I had one little tidbit about Dr. Converse, that she's won lots of awards, but the one that was noted most recently is the 2014-2015 Samuel H. Smith Leadership Award. So we're very proud to have her presenting this important information to you today. So I will turn it over to Dr. Converse.
Okay, so when Rebecca asked me, I don't really feel like I need a microphone, as you can tell, but since we have to do this, would I do a presentation on motivating students to come to class prepared? I thought, well, I don't know that this is really something I know a lot about. I don't pretend in any way to be an expert, but I've done a lot of exploring about this idea because obviously it's a huge problem. So I've talked to a lot of colleagues, I've read some things, I've thought about it, I've experimented. So what I'm hoping is we'll just share some ideas today with you and just see if some of these things are helpful to design a class. And one of those is to offer value beyond the book. So would you take a second and just make a note? How do you give value beyond the book? In your class, can they get all the material if they stay home? Or is there something happening in the classroom that gives them some value beyond the book? Then would you take a second and just share those ideas with the people near you? So what are some of the things you do, and go ahead and have a short conversation.
Like now, after they're done with this, should I make a a microphone up front of at one end or the other, or will you?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. I'll just stand up and be ready to go.
Okay.
Wait for the mic, and then we'll get two going, and then I can grab the one that's done being used.
You want me to go to that end with one?
No, I was going to say,
Okay.
I mean, you know,
Okay.
like if
Oh, I see what you
somebody
mean.
at this end,
Gotcha.
I'll get, yeah.
Maybe not. I think this is fine as is. I'll just watch. Okay. Okay, so the next topic is basically this problem of the fact that we now have cell phones and computers in class. The music building for the longest time didn't have internet in the classrooms, which was kind of a blessing. And so we just didn't deal with it. But now we do. So now students have their computers and they have their cell phones in the classroom. And the problem for the teacher is, how can you be more interesting than social media? So again, take a minute and think about your own class. Are you more interesting than social media? And if so, how? You can't say I'm not.